Welcome back to Children of the Light by Michael Mastrella. Before we get right into Chapter 3, I just want to thank the subscribers who have stuck with me. I know this release process has been as unpredictable as can be because life is very busy and priority lists are long. But the kids are off from school this week, so no distance learning. Yay! Um, let's get right into it then. 3. The Macabre Fantastique. Quote, in grimmer moods, my mother would say, sex is a sin and children are the hell you pay. Unquote. From Arnie Cuddebuck, Why I Did It. Dawn thought she'd seen, heard, or imagined every scenario to be encountered on the road. Completely at a loss, having no well from which to dip, she resorted to keeping them talking. She said, how did the poor girl go astray, if you don't mind my asking? Mr. Davidson said, I don't like to talk about it. But since it relates to your situation, I must try. Mrs. Davidson chimed in with, I can tell her, honey. Mr. Davidson said, no, dear, I can do it. And Mrs. Foley should be reminded that, since I already know the story, I'm more interested in her reaction. Don told Mrs. Davidson, Mrs. Foley knows. The muzzle of the gun that Mrs. Davidson was holding found its way through her bun and tickled her scalp. Just so you don't think we'll get lost in the memories and forget that you are analyzing every second for its ability to allow your escape. Mrs. Foley knows. Good, said Mr. Davidson. Now how to put this for you to understand? Why do you need me to understand? There's a gun to my head. A gun to the head is fleeting. We need you to understand for after the gun is gone. That's when it really counts. People will say anything and agree to anything if it will spare their life or stop the pain. Don thought, damn, these two are prepared. They have far more experience behind a gun than I have in front of one. Mr. Davidson sighed. This is important for you, Mrs. Foley. Your son is still so young. You don't know the pain of an intelligently grown-up child deciding that everything you've done in their best interests is wrong. Your little boy is still a lump of clay that hasn't been molded yet, unaware of the alternatives to your ways. When he does see those ways and decides that they are better than your ways, it breaks your heart. I found a book in Jan's room. It was a book that had no business in our house. A book we'd raised her to burn, not to read. Don said, a book. It was not a question. It was frustrated disbelief. Mr. Davidson went on, let me tell you, I was almost glad that my wife had lost her vision. If she had been cleaning Jan's room and come across it, she would have died of a heart attack right on the spot. Don thought, a book. Even if they were religious nuts and had found the Satanic Bible, it would not justify going to these lengths. Mr. Davidson said, I'm even ashamed. In this position of power, I'm ashamed to admit what I found in my very own daughter's room. Because no words I choose to describe it will convey the pure evil of... Give it a shot, Don interrupted. Mr. Davidson said, it was Dracula. Dracula? Mr. Davidson nodded. I'm afraid so. Don said, the one written by Bram Stoker? None other. What's wrong with that? Where, oh, where to begin? They're taking over, that's where. Vampires? No, Mrs. Foley, vampires don't exist. At least not the genuine article. The hordes of copycats and wannabes out there, but we're not worried about them. It's the vampire myths that are taking over. Don said, so? See, Mr. Davidson said, I told you that no words could convey. You just need to have the keen insight, I guess. Keep trying, Don said. and thought, keep talking and giving away your weaknesses. People with mythical beliefs are difficult to dissuade, but easy to manipulate. Mr. Davidson kept talking. Every new year brings dozens of new books on vampires, series characters, nonfiction historical accounts, reprints of classics. There's practically an entire section devoted to vampires in bookstores. So what? Don said. They're just books. Just books? What if every book available to young, moldable minds promoted the benefits of Nazism or the advantages of totalitarianism for the citizens? Don ignored his slip of the tongue there. Then people would still make up their own minds on those subjects. Mrs. Foley, people are more easily swayed than you think. Don thought, I hope so. Mr. Davidson said, the evidence is everywhere, but most nitwits are too deaf, dumb, and blind, and deaf and dumb to notice. Don thought, oh, here comes the conspiracy theory. And Mr. Davidson said, it happens at the imperceptible level, a level so quiet and cunning you don't notice what's happening until it's already happened. Like with our beautiful daughter, like with you, Mrs. Foley. It's like when you say something sarcastically, at first it's funny, it makes people laugh, it catches on. So you say and perpetrate that sarcastic idea, and others are retelling your sarcastic idea, only they are retelling it as if you said it seriously, which is a regular failing of gossip. But you know what? They're right. Eventually, after saying it so many times, after forgetting the very genesis of the idea, it does become serious to you. You never even notice the transition from sarcastic to serious. You think it doesn't matter. But one day, without realizing, you're promoting an idea you once insulted. And this time, you actually believe it. Absently, Don said, I'm sorry, I'm lost. And it was because she was identifying with his theory and was disgusted. Mr. Davidson took that as needing to give further explanation. I don't mean an actual sentence or saying that you repeat like a catchphrase. I mean an idea that initially you found preposterous. And every time the idea was mentioned, it was mentioned in a way that shows your stance on the ridiculousness of the idea. But eventually the idea comes to fruition. It has become so prevalent in your mind that it has become reality. It happened with slavery, and it happened with genocide, and now it's happening with vampires. And Don thought, just like it happened with her spine. She had immediately regretted telling her friend the diagnosis. By the end of the week, everyone in high school knew, and the greetings quickly changed from, what's up, or how you doing, to, how's your back doing? She became the broken back girl. The comments never quite reached a bullying level, but it seemed to be her new identity when all she wanted was for it to go away. So despite the pain that nagged it every day and the possible solutions that were always on her mind, the response became fine, or good, or floating on a cloud, until the question stopped. Then one day she found herself standing in front of Captain Dale Scranton quoting the Americans with Disabilities Act, saying, I'm not a liability, I'm not a pain. I'll put a pillow in the cruiser and I'll use ice as needed, I'm fine. And she'd believed her own words that initially were sarcastic. And Mr. Davidson was continuing, it's still in the fledgling stages. It's still the sarcastic remark being repeated for amusement, but the transition is happening now. The ship has been tipping for centuries. We hope to stop it. Don said, but why is that so important to you? Don't you have real problems to deal with? It's the crux of all problems, Mrs. Foley. It's what the myth stands for that is so detrimental. When the myth becomes reality, it means the end of humanity. Don tried to ignore the grandiose statements and keep it in the real world. And for what does the myth stand? You're doing it, Mrs. Foley. You proved my point. How's that? You asked sarcastically, faking interest in the subject. Right now, it does seem ridiculous to the average person, but you will say it with authority. Oh, you will. The sarcasm he referred to had been Don's defense against the disgust of relating her life to his vision. Sympathizing with the captors had to be avoided at all costs. Why do you want me to, Mr. Davidson? Because you're going to join us. There it is, the weakness, the vulnerability that Dawn could use to her own advantage. Mr. Davidson said, "You will, Mrs. Foley, trust me, you will. Or you'll kill my family, right?" Might as well be yourself. These two had already demonstrated an ability to foresee counteractions. They would know if she was faking. If they really wanted her to join them, the transition would need to be made naturally. But somehow, she just didn't think they really wanted that. She didn't really believe that they would want to take a total stranger, abduct her, threaten her life and her family, and then expect her to join their side of a battle. Yet she was still alive. So Mr. Davidson saw her thinking about it and said, "Oh, Mrs. Foley, we won't need meager threats to hold you when you see the light of our side." "So go on," she said, thinking of the slaves who fought for the Confederates in the American Civil War, the scientists who designed the atomic bomb, the patsies who took the falls for assassins. If history taught anything, it was that people could act uncharacteristically with the proper convincing. She said, "What's the light?" "We're still in the dark, Mrs. Foley. We're still with the joke becoming reality." "Where was I?" Mrs. Davidson chimed in with, "What the myth stands for, honey." Mr. Davidson said, "Thanks, honey. What the myth stands for and why it must be prevented at all costs. It may take human lives to accomplish that, but humanity itself will go on." Don said, "If? So, since you're interested, Mrs. Foley, have you ever read a vampire story?" "A few." "A few. Well, let me ask you something. What did all of them and everyone ever written have in common?" "Other than vampires? I don't know." "They all suck." He waited for her response. Was it a bad joke, like the buckle up remark? She forced the corners of her mouth up and nodded for him to continue. "It's not a joke, Mrs. Foley. Vampire stories suck. They suck the lifeblood, just like the vampires about which they are written. They sap the mind. They drain the imagination. Every storyline of every vampire story ever written ends with, how do they all end, Mrs. Foley? With someone getting their blood sucked? Exactly. No imagination is needed when every plot line of a character's life, no matter how complexly drawn, no matter how elaborate the trail, leads to one or more characters being eaten. No sense of wonder is born when you know from the first that it's going to end with a draining. No awe is inspired when the time comes after following them through thick and thin to see them exsanguinated." "I'm a police officer, not an English professor. This is probably something you should take up with the literary community." "It's something we need to take up with everyone. It's everywhere. It's the fatalist attitude of the young. I'm just going to die anyway. My wife learned the hard way. With Janice growing older and gone most of the day, Mrs. Davidson finally found herself with enough time to start a literary publication, The Macabre Fantastique, a title she'd come to regret when, guess what was submitted every day, each and every day without fail? Vampire stories? You're a smart one, Mrs. Foley. Oh, there was a good story here and there with an original concept and an ending she truly didn't see coming. But almost half of the hundreds of stories that showed up every month centered around vampires. There are dozens of tropes and cliches, zombies, aliens, werewolves, serial killers, yet almost half of everything that came in focused on one single trope. Why?" Dawn shrugged, her hands out. "Not because it's interesting, not because it's challenging to the reader, and not because it's challenging to the writer, and definitely not because it says something about our culture or society or humanity at large. It's popular because it's easy. It's the easiest possible trope to use. Imagine reading through hundreds of stories per month that set up a character and a situation only to find out, surprise, it's a vampire. Stories that end with, and then the feeding began. Stories that tell you it's a vampire from the get-go and then do nothing with it because it's easy, it's lazy." Mrs. Davidson added, "I never saw one worth publishing." Mr. Davidson went on, "And after a few months of complaining to me, she changed the submission guidelines, specifically stating no vampires. End of story, right?" Wrong, Mrs. Davidson added. Wrong, Mr. Davidson said. She received almost as many, maybe a third of all submissions. Know why? Because, first of all, most writers don't read guidelines. They just read the title of the publication and say, bingo, here's a good place to send my story that no one else will publish. But that was small potatoes compared to the really frustrating part. The stories that arrived with a cover letter insisting that their take on vampires was good and original and surprising. Mrs. Davidson even believed a few of them, only to waste another hour of her life with a story concerning a man or woman who was scared for a while, and then they die by, surprise, a vampire. And then the feeding begins, quoted Mrs. Davidson. Mr. Davidson said, that's another problem. Most of them are written in the present tense, first person or second person present tense. Their story is so boring that they have to scream, this is happening right now, to you even. Sure it is. Don said, this is quite the pet peeve you have going. You'll see, Mrs. Foley, my wife, a sadness came over him. She just couldn't take it anymore. I saw it. I tried to help her in every way I knew, but her passion got the best of her. She got to the point of thinking, I can't take it anymore. And then it was, I'd rather go blind than read another. And then it was, I'd rather stab my eyes out than read another. And then I will stab my eyes out if I read another. But even then, she resisted. She's not a nutcase. She was driven to her actions through literary torture. The next 3 stories were all the same, Mrs. Davidson said. All the same. She read the last word of the 3rd story, realized there was no new twist or irony to the theme. She sat back in her chair, held her composure for a moment, and then, in a spasm of helpless rage, she grabbed the letter opener and pop, pop. Mrs. Davidson said, I'd rather be blind than see my world consumed by such a detrimental myth. Mr. Davidson said, she's lucky to be alive. All alone that day, me at work and Jan at school. Mrs. Davidson said, I wanted to stay alive, therefore I'm alive. No one dies unless they want to die. I wanted to live so I could see the end of the myth, whatever it took. Mr. Davidson added, I never liked it that much to begin with. An easy trope for hacks to molest without knowing what they're doing. But when I learned of what it drove Mrs. Davidson to do to herself, a loved mother and wife, I knew it had to be stopped. Lucky for us, we weren't alone. We found a group of like-minded intellectuals, led by a great man. Don asked, what group is that? You'll see, Mrs. Davidson. Is the curiosity supposed to convert me? Nothing so simple. Mrs. Davidson blurted out, you're the blind one. And it seemed to Don that she'd been yearning to unleash that line on someone, and this was the closest she could come to a chance to do that. After waiting for the awkwardness to fade, Mr. Davidson said, just be patient, Mrs. Foley. We're almost there. What in the world is going on here? And that concludes Chapter 3 of Children of the Light by Michael Mastrella. Leave some comments if you feel like it, and subscribe if you want to hear more. I might just do more of these because some very kind and perceptive comments have said they actually like the narrating, and I choose to believe them. So let's hope that some more slices of time can open up in my schedule and we can get some more of the story to you, or that I can start learning and get back on the track to professional publication. If not, then see you never again. Goodbye.